My parents didn't come to my wedding. Your sister needed us more that weekend, Mom said. I smiled in every photo. 3 years later, they called me from her driveway. She kicked us out. We have nowhere to go. I said, I know a place, and texted them the address of the shelter 2 blocks from her house. Dad said I was cruel. Mom said nothing. Then Mom called back and said something that changed everything. My name is Jared. I'm 34 years old, and I'm a staff accountant at a mid-sized commercial real estate firm, which means I spend my days making sure that money lands exactly where it's supposed to. Numbers go where they belong, errors get found and corrected, everything reconciles. I'm very good at it. This is a story about how I stopped doing that for free. But let me back up first. I grew up in DeKalb, Illinois, which is the kind of town that's not small enough to be charming and not large enough to be interesting. We lived in a beige house on a street of beige houses, and my parents, Hank and Lorraine, ran their lives the way my father once described accounting to me when I was 9. You put the numbers where they belong and don't ask questions. He was not, for the record, an accountant. He worked at a hardware distribution center for 22 years. The accounting metaphor was just one of his sayings, and I always found it funny. In the dry, quiet way things are funny when they're also a little sad. That the one piece of career wisdom he passed down was about a job he'd never done. My sister Paige was 4 years older than me, which in a family like ours meant she had a 4-year head start on being the one who mattered. I want to be clear, I don't think my parents were cruel people. I think they were distracted people who fell into a habit early and never once examined it. Paige was the performer, theater, a regional award my parents still mention. The kind of personality that filled every room and then kept filling it until the room felt slightly smaller. I understood why they oriented toward her. Gravity does that. But here's what gravity looked like in practice. When Paige won the theater award, my parents threw a dinner party. When I made honor roll the same semester, for the 3rd time, my dad said, "Good job, bud," from behind the sports section, and my mom suggested I call Aunt Ruthie. I was 13. I remember standing in the kitchen trying to figure out whether that counted as a celebration. When Paige turned 16, they got her a car. When I turned 16, I got a card and a 20 and was told I could use my mom's car on Saturdays if she didn't need it. She usually needed it. When Paige dropped out of community college and moved back home, the house rearranged itself around her. When I left for college 2 years later, my mom handed me a shower caddy and said, "You've always been so independent." She meant it as a compliment. When I got my first real internship, actual accounting firm, 3 rounds of interviews, I called home. My mom said, "That's wonderful, honey." Then, 4 seconds later, asked if I'd talked to Paige lately because she'd had a hard week. These are not giant wounds. Each one alone sounds petty. Together they add up to a very specific number. I moved to Chicago at 22, and it felt like putting down a bag I'd been carrying so long I'd stopped noticing its weight. I got a job at the firm, entry-level data entry and reconciliations, door cracked open, and I rented a 1-bedroom in Pilsen with a kitchen window that faced a neighbor's garden. In summer, there were tomatoes. I don't know why that detail mattered so much, but it did. I got a cat named Roosevelt. Gray, deeply uninterested in my emotional state. I found this comforting. My best friend was Declan, who I'd met in college when we were assigned to the same group project. He arrived 45 minutes late with coffee and no apology, which should have been a red flag and was somehow just exactly who he was. In 8 years of friendship, Declan had never once been on time, but he'd driven 4 hours in a January snowstorm when my car broke down near Rockford. He arrived 45 minutes after he said he would, didn't mention the snow, and helped me push the car to the shoulder. There are people who show up on time and people who show up when it matters. The two groups overlap less than you'd expect. At work, I had a manager named Sloan, 3 blazers in rotation, efficient, who returned your work not with corrections but with questions. What were you trying to show here? Annoying for 3 months, then the most useful professional habit I'd ever developed. I still called home every Sunday, still drove to DeKalb for Thanksgiving and Christmas. I kept showing up consistently, without being asked. Hold that detail. It matters to the math later. The moment I couldn't pretend anymore happened on a Tuesday in November, roughly 2 years before the wedding. I called home to tell my parents I'd been promoted to senior accountant. It was real. Title change, meaningful raise, a sign that 4 years of careful work had been noticed by people whose job it was to notice. Sloan had pulled me aside after a department meeting with that directness she had. "You've been operating at this level for a year. The title should match the work." I'd sat in my car in the parking garage for a while afterward, just sitting with it, before I drove home and called my parents. My mom answered on the second ring. I told her about the promotion, the title, what it meant, what came next. She said, "Oh, Jared, that's so great." And then, after a pause, I timed it approximately 4 seconds. She said, "Actually, I'm so glad you called. I've been meaning to ask, could you help Paige with her taxes? She got a letter from the IRS, and she's very stressed about it." I sat with that for a moment. The promotion, the one I'd called to share, had existed as a topic for roughly 12 seconds before becoming a segue into a favor for my sister. "Sure," I said. "I'll reach out to her." "You're such a good brother," my mom said. "That's not a compliment. That's a job assignment with a title change." I told myself it was fine, drove it down, filed it away in the place where I kept all the other small receipts. I was wrong to do that, but I did it anyway. Naomi and I got engaged in March. She was a graphic designer with an absurd amount of natural talent and a laugh that made strangers look up from their phones, which is not nothing in Chicago. We'd been together 3 years, and the decision to get married had felt less like a leap and more like a formality, a catching up of paperwork to match a situation that was already true. We planned a September wedding. Small, 40 people, a venue outside the city, food from a restaurant we loved, a playlist Declan spent 6 weeks building with the intensity normally reserved for doctoral dissertations. I told my parents in May. My mom cried in the good way. My dad said, "September weather's usually decent," which from him was practically a sonnet. We sent save the dates in June. Both parents confirmed. My mom sent a card with a check inside, which I thought was genuinely sweet, and told Naomi so. 3 weeks before the wedding, my mom called. She opened with, "This is so hard to tell you," which in my family was the traditional throat clearing that preceded a decision already made. Paige, she explained, was having a crisis. A relationship had ended badly. She'd been calling them every day. She needed them, specifically that weekend, our wedding weekend. She was afraid to be alone, and they felt they needed to be with her. I heard myself say, "What do you mean, be with her?" And my mom said, "We're not going to make it to the wedding, honey. Your sister needs us more that weekend." I want to tell you what that felt like. The honest answer is, it didn't feel like anything at first. Just a minute of silence on my end, and my mother filling it with explanations. And me standing in my apartment watching Roosevelt walk across the kitchen counter and knock a pen off the edge onto the floor, the way he did every single time, as though genuinely surprised by gravity. "Okay," I said. "You understand," she said. "I'll let Naomi know," I said. I hung up and sat on the floor for a while. The apartment made its small sounds. Roosevelt stepped on my leg and then stepped off again. I didn't cry loudly. I just sat there, very still, and let the math finish computing. I smiled in every photo. I need you to know that. I smiled because Naomi was radiant, and the day was real, and the people who showed up were there in the fullest sense of the word. Declan gave a toast that made everyone laugh and then made 3 people cry, which was exactly the right order. My mother-in-law danced to a song she admitted she didn't know. The food was right. The light was right. I smiled, and I mostly meant it, but there's a photo from right before the ceremony, just me adjusting my tie in a mirror in the coat room, and I know the expression I'm wearing in that picture. It's the face of someone who has just finished the calculation and doesn't like the result. 2 weeks after the wedding, Paige posted photos online. I'd had her on mute for most of the year, but Declan saw them and texted me a screenshot without comment. Just the image. Paige at a vineyard. My parents, one on each side. My mom with a wine glass. My dad with the specific satisfied expression he got after a decent meal in a nice setting. The caption, "Needed this after a hard few weeks. Family is everything." The date on the post, a Sunday. Our wedding had been a Saturday. They had driven to Cincinnati to be with my sister during her crisis, stayed the night, and the following day gone to a vineyard. I have the screenshot saved. I've looked at it exactly once since, because once was enough to understand the full shape of what had happened. Your sister needs us more that weekend. And she did. She needed them for the wine country trip. She needed an audience for her recovery. I was simply the thing they'd had to not attend first. I didn't call. I didn't text. I didn't say anything to anyone except Naomi, who looked at the screenshot, set down her coffee, and said, "Okay, what do you need?" I told her I needed to sit with it for a while. She said, "Take the time," and then she went to bed and left the light on. What I sat with over the following days was this. I had been showing up for a relationship that had never been reciprocal. I had been funding, with time and presence and forgiveness and free tax help, something that was not actually a relationship. It was a function. I had been performing a function. That was the moment I stopped. I stopped calling on Sundays. The first week felt strange. By the third week, it felt like removing shoes you'd been wearing indoors for years. Not dramatic, just a quiet relief, and the faint surprise that the floor was still there. I gave it 10 weeks to see when they'd notice. The answer was 7, but not because they missed me. My dad called because he couldn't log into his email. My mom's follow-up, 2 days later, was to ask if I could review some condo documents because Paige was thinking about buying. Not, "How are you?" Not, "We haven't heard from you." The world had continued exactly as it would have without me. I helped with the email. I didn't call back about the condo. These were small, quiet choices that don't make good stories, but that collectively constitute the act of finally telling the truth. Sloan promoted me to accounting manager that spring. She said, in that direct way she had, "You've been doing this job for 8 months. We're catching the title up to the work." I took Declan to dinner to celebrate. He was 19 minutes late. He brought a card designed for a retirement party, but had written inside it, by hand, 3 sentences about what watching me work had taught him. I kept the card in my desk drawer. I started seeing a therapist named Dr. Leland. Small office, large clock with a loud second hand, the habit of waiting 1 beat longer than normal after you finish speaking. Enough to make you wonder if you were actually done. 3 months in, I told him the full sequence. He listened. Then, "You've been the load-bearing wall. That's not the same as being loved. It's being useful, which is not nothing, but it's also not what you thought it was." I thought about every Sunday drive, every holiday I showed up to, every tax return filed for my sister without being asked. "Can you step back from a load-bearing wall?" I asked. "You can," he said. "The building might shift, but it won't fall. And either way, it's not your job to hold it up forever." I told Naomi that night. She looked at me across the table and said, "You've known this a long time. You just needed someone to say it in a language you trusted. Numbers, walls, structures." She wasn't wrong. And for the first time in a very long time, I went to sleep without bracing for something I couldn't name. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, 31 months after the wedding. My dad's number. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd been in the middle of a quarterly close, but something made me answer. An accountant's instinct. The number is telling you something, and you don't get to decide whether to hear it. Jared. His voice had a texture I'd only heard a few times before. Flat and thin, stripped of the usual bluster. "We're at Paige's. She asked us to leave. We're in the driveway. We have nowhere to go." I stood at my kitchen counter and looked out the window at the neighbor's garden. October. The tomatoes were long gone. "What happened?" I asked. He explained, in the clipped, military report style he used when he didn't want to narrate the parts that were embarrassing, that they'd been staying with Paige for 3 weeks while their furnace was replaced. There had been a fight. Things had been said. Paige had asked them to leave, and they had left because what else do you do when your daughter, the one whose crisis always takes precedence, tells you to get out? "We were hoping," he said, "that maybe you could—" "I know a place," I said. And I texted them the address of a shelter 2 blocks from Paige's house. I'd found it in the 40 seconds between "we have nowhere to go" and the end of his sentence, because I'm an accountant and I do the math in real time, and the math here was not complicated. There was a silence, a long one. "That's a shelter," my dad said. "It is," I said. "It has good reviews, clean intake process. They take walk-ins. You're suggesting we go to a shelter?" His voice had moved out of thin and into something harder, the register he used when he decided he was right about something. "Jared, that is cruel. That is genuinely a cruel thing to do." And I was calm. I want to be precise about that, not cold, not performed, genuinely calm. The way you're calm when you've been carrying a thing for 3 years and have finally set it down in the right place. "On the day of my wedding," I said, "you drove to Cincinnati to take Paige to a vineyard. I know this because she posted it. The next day, with the date visible." I have the screenshot if the details matter. You chose with full information, and I watched you choose, and I never said anything because I kept telling myself you'd eventually notice on your own. I paused. You didn't. So, no, I'm not cruel. I'm just not the person you thought you could call. He didn't say anything. There's also a Holiday Inn 12 minutes from Paige's house, I said. I looked that up too. I hung up. Roosevelt walked into the kitchen, looked at me, and walked back out. Outside, a neighbor was raking leaves. My mom did not call that night. She called the next morning, a little before 9. I'd prepared for the call I expected. The defense, the reframing, Paige's crisis repositioned as genuine emergency. My response characterized as cold and petulant. I had the dates, the screenshot, the receipts. I was ready to read them out the way you read a balance sheet, not with anger, just with accuracy. But that wasn't the call she made. She was quiet for the first several seconds, long enough that I checked to see if the line had dropped. Then she said, "We weren't there. At your wedding. We should have been there." I didn't say anything. "I've thought about it more than you'd expect," she said. I kept telling myself it was the right call, that Paige needed us, that you understood, because you always understand. You've always been the one who understands. And then I saw that photo again last month. Paige reposted it, one of those memory things. And I sat with it, Jared. I sat with what it actually looked like from the outside. "Okay," I said. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't think I'd know what to do with that right now. I just needed to say it out loud. I was wrong. We were wrong. I've been wrong about the math for a long time. The math," she said, the math. I don't know if she knew she was using the word, but I felt it land somewhere specific, the way the right number lands when you've been staring at a spreadsheet that won't balance, and suddenly the error is obvious and you understand not just the mistake, but why you kept making it. "I hear you," I said. "That's all I wanted," she said. And then, quieter. "You looked so good in those photos. Naomi sent me some of them, did you know that? She sent them to me a few months after. She didn't have to do that. I hadn't known that." I stood in my kitchen and thought about my wife, who had every reason not to, sending wedding photos to the woman who'd chosen a vineyard instead. We didn't fix anything on that call. There was no Hollywood resolution, no tearful reconciliation, no acknowledgement that erased the years of Sunday calls and missed promotions and tax returns filed on behalf of the person who apparently couldn't survive a weekend without an audience. My dad has not called back. Paige and I have exchanged exactly 4 texts in the past year, all logistical. The holidays are quieter now and smaller, and sometimes it's just Declan and Naomi and Roosevelt and a meal nobody has to justify. But here's what changed. Something in my chest that had been braced for a long time stopped being braced. Not all at once, not like a door opening, more like a house settling. The slow release of structural tension that had become so familiar I'd stopped noticing it was there. Dr. Leland said, "In one of our last sessions, you're not grieving your family. You're grieving the family you wanted that never existed." He was right. And grieving a thing that never existed is a specific kind of grief, one that doesn't resolve exactly, but that you can eventually set down and walk away from. One evening in November, Naomi came home from a project deadline looking wrecked, and I'd made dinner, nothing fancy, the pasta she liked, and we ate at the kitchen table with Roosevelt occupying the chair between us like a small gray chaperone. She looked up from her plate and said, "This is nice." Not "thank you" or "you're wonderful" or any of the things you say in the big moments. Just "this is nice." And I looked around the kitchen, the garden next door in its late autumn state, the cat, the pasta, the woman across from me, and thought, yes, this is the thing I built. This is exactly where the numbers are supposed to go. My name is Jared. I'm 34 years old. I'm a good accountant, careful, thorough, honest about what the numbers say, even when the answer is inconvenient. 3 years after a wedding where I smiled in every photograph, I finally did for myself what I'd been doing for balance sheets my entire career. I found where the weight had been misallocated. I corrected the entry. And the books, for the first time in a very long time, actually balanced. That's not cruelty. That's not coldness. That's not a son turning his back on his family. That's just math. And it finally balances.